Our final speaker for today is also well across these issues of empire and Indigenous culture, right across a whole range of marginalised or oppressed people. She is a distinguished academic, widely published, also a distinguished materialist in the sense that she's been responsible for a lot of the teaching at the Art Gallery of South Australia. She's a notable feminist historian of war. Would you join me in welcoming Professor Cathy Speck?
Thank you, David, for your kind words. Thank you. So, I have to tell you at the outset, I wrote a very ambitious abstract for Richard, and I have to confess I couldn't deliver. It was too ambitious, and so I'm doing a zone of it. So I'll say that up front. This paper looks at the later 19th century and how from the centenary years of the 1880s to Federation, new forms of landscape painting emerged in Australia, what I call painting from the inside out, by a group of artists who were either Australian-born or who spent a significant part of their lives in Australia. Their vision differed greatly from that of an earlier group of émigrés, such as Eugene von Gerard, we've heard about his work today, or earlier still, travelling artists such as Augustus Earle, who interpreted the land in front of them, and for those artists, frequently according to an Anglo-European framework, or frameworks that they brought with them, in which art was variously a tool of science or an agent of civility or morality or respectability. The work of the artists to whom I'm referring, the Australian Impressionists such as Tom Roberts or Arthur Streeton, is so embedded with national agendas, the centenary of settlement in the 1880s and then Federation in 1901, that it's been difficult to step back and to consider their work from a fresh perspective and to remember that this group included women. And I've got one of the women's works here, and to see similar styles in vogue in American art. The focus on the late 19th century for this paper stemmed initially from Tim Bonyhady's view that new worlds from old, now that was the Australian-American exhibition before continental shifts, so it stemmed from his view that new worlds from old didn't do justice to Impressionist artists, whereas the 2016 version does, Continental Shifts, but on closer examination, neither exhibition paid sufficient attention to the women artists. New Worlds from Old included just this one, Clara Southern's rather nostalgic rendition of bush life. Continental Shift has no work by women. So to turn first to landscape paintings. They carry meaning, they're not mute, because landscape, as W.J.T. Mitchell reminds us, is a medium of exchange. Landscape then is a category bound and constrained by received understandings of this kind. James Elkins suggests it's an intractable subject because it's something we inhabit without being different from it. We are in it, he says. But the idea of inhabiting the landscape and being in it gives us a clue. The later 19th century artists I'm considering, male and female, all immersed themselves in the landscape. It was the era of plein airism and artists' camps, and so armed with this performative approach to their work, we're going to explore their paintings from a new angle. Artists in this group, Tom Roberts, Arthur Streeton, Charles Conder, and especially the Scottish-born Jane Sutherland, who came to Australia at the age of 9, were all Australian-born or arrived in this country at a relatively young age. All were Australian-trained at Melbourne's National Gallery School. They explored new painterly approaches being pursued internationally by Impressionists, which were the impulse to paint contemporary life and experience directly from nature, to study the effects of nature's light, and to use a lighter palette and looser brushwork to proclaim the artist's individuality and sincerity and the immediacy of the experience that the canvas mediated for the viewer. Tom Roberts, the leader of this group of artists, had seen these approaches employed while overseas from 1881 to 1885, especially in the hands of Whistler and by the Australian expatriate John Peter Russell, who'd worked with Monet. He returned to Australia in 1885, but while he was away, the seeds for plein airism were sown by a group of immigrant painters, the Englishman Julian Ashton and A.J. Daplin, and the Portuguese artist Arthur Loureiro, and there was a fashion for nature and fresh air. In the summer of 1885 and 1886, Roberts began painting on plein air at Box Hill, just out of Melbourne, with fellow artists Fred McCubbin and Louis Abrams. Then, in 1886, Roberts, along with a wider group including Arthur Streeton, Charles Conder and Walter Withers, began inhabiting the landscape. They set up an artist camp at Box Hill, and for fear of showing you an iconic painting, it is in fact part of this account, so they began inhabiting the landscape. They set up an artist camp at Box Hill, which was in close proximity to Melbourne. The bush there, and I'm using bush in inverted commas, it was in fact a small remaining area still a small remaining area surrounded by cultivated farmland. And this area of bush became the subject for numerous paintings, such as the painting in front of your eyes, The Artist's Camp, which conveys all the veracity of bush life. And if you come in from the bottom right through those young gums, you see the degree to which they inhabited that area of the bush. They live there, they sleep there, they work there. The clothing on the top of that tent post is no doubt their artist's smock. They eat there. This is their home. But look beyond the clearing, deeper beyond, and there is the illusion of even deeper bush. The railway had been put through to Box Hill in 1882, and the bush paddocks on which they camped belonged to their friend and farmer David Houston, and it was just a mile from the station. Jane Sutherland, another artist in their group, couldn't stay overnight at the camp because she was a woman, so issues of respectability prevailed, so she would join them on day trips. Now, these Impressionist artists, like their literary colleagues, were the first group of Australian artists to consciously style themselves as bohemians and as different from the European-trained artists who'd preceded them, the ones we heard about this morning. This was a time when there was a marked growth in the number of artists and writers in Australia, their number increasing threefold between 1881 and 1891. There was a new sense of professionalism for male and female artists alike, surrounding their local training and practice. Jane Sutherland trained at the National Gallery School for 14 years from 1871. Women artists were aspiring for higher education, independence and a paying profession, and exchanging marriage for careers. Many were involved in the Women's Suffrage Society, which formed in 1885. They frequented artists and writers' clubs such as the Buonarroti Club. Jane Sutherland, as a woman, was the first honorary member, as a woman, and she was also on the Council of the Victorian Artists' Society. Discussion on the convergence of art with emerging nationalism was often on the agenda of the Buonarroti Club. But as Juliet Peers has observed, some women, including Jane Sutherland, were not inhibited or constrained by the loud voice of masculine nationalism. Rather, what they did was to insert a feminist voice in plein airism. When Adam Lindsay Gordon's poetry was up for discussion in August 1886, he was a favourite of the male Impressionists. Fellow poet Alice Brotherton linked his poetry to the plein air movement. Then she sketched out a range of subjects that excluded the normal feminine menu of still life, domestic interiors, or even historical subjects, and instead she said people should be painting landscapes, scenes of action, nature, out of doors. Unornamented nature became the counterpart of passions and emotions. As bohemians, therefore, the male and the female artists consciously turned to bush imagery. In 1987, Lee Asprey called these people, these artists, city bushmen. Today, we'd use much more inclusive language, while the establishing of artist camps was part of a wider phenomenon taking place internationally, such as in France at Étape, in Britain at St Ives, and so on, of artists consciously choosing to work outside metropolitan centres to portray rural subjects. This impressionist style of painting on plein air, with apparently informal compositions, combined with employing loose brushwork based on immediacy and spontaneity, and the idea that the sketch is the finished piece, are factors that unleashed a new range of subjects. Light and colour presented a new way of portraying the landscape, while painterly approaches included truth to nature. And in painting, the first thing to look for is the general impression of colour, and that an effect is only ever momentary. Jane Sutherland shared a teaching studio with Clara Southern in the Grosvenor Chambers in Collins Street, Melbourne. Tom Roberts had a studio next door, and these studios were very much a hub of activity and a centre for the exchange of ideas for artists working in an impressionist manner. Jane Sutherland's landscapes are very much a quieter engagement with nature, with light and with colour, and they include the one in front of you, Obstruction, Box Hill, showing a young girl out walking, possibly on her way to school. She appears to be carrying a school bag, but as you can see, her path forward is blocked, first by a fence, then by a bull, then by a low branch. She hasn't got a hope of going that way. While the wispy grasses in the foreground convey an impression of the bush. Now, second wave feminists, in fact, had an absolute picnic on that kind of imagery. They often referred to the fences restricting the free movement of women and children through the bush. But in fact, I'm going to move beyond that. I'm going to say that the fences also signify settlement, and also that the idea of the bush is an impressionist artifice, a fiction. Sutherland and Southern, remember they shared a studio together, they prepared work for the legendary 9x5 Impressions exhibition at Buxton's Gallery in Melbourne in 1889, which announced the new Impressionist style, but it seems they withdrew their work, Jane Clark suggests, due to adverse publicity leading up to the opening. Now, work that much talked about 9x5 Impressions exhibition included Charles Conder's frequently Japanese studies, such as this one, Going Home. Where am I? I've lost myself. Oh, sorry, I'll start that sentence again. Work shown, such as Charles Conder's frequently Japanese studies, took in metropolitan and domestic subjects, such as the fading light in Going Home, which shows a couple, as you can see, walking home, or Herrick's Blossoms, with its gestures towards fleeting form, or Tom Roberts' study of a young girl reading Harper's Weekly, or Arthur Streeton's Impressions for Golden Summers, or A Golden Summer. And I should just add as an aside, I was really interested when I was reading about this exhibition. It was an extremely elaborate exhibition, and there was music played at the opening and a young woman singing. But a nice point for our American guests is that it was an American oak organ that they played on. And I just thought that in itself says so much about the rich cultural exchange then that we often forget. The 9x5 Impressions exhibition was reviewed adversely by the conservative art critic James Smith, who described this kind of work as resembling crude and disconnected scraps of musical composition. He said, "It's simply a record in colour of some fugitive effect which he sees or professes to see in nature. It's like primeval chaos. It is without form or void." This adverse review prompted Roberts, Conder and Streeton, not unexpectedly, to defend their work in a letter to the editor of the Argus as impressions in painting, and to predict that the style would go on to become a great school of painting in Australia. Now, the interesting art historical point, in fact, is that these Australian Impressionists were fully aware that they were working in a globally modern world, where variants of Impressionism were being practiced everywhere. For instance, They were reading American magazines such as the Century magazine and Harper's Monthly. I can't explain why Roberts called his painting Harper's Weekly, because they were reading Harper's Monthly, and that carried accounts of French Impressionism. The title page of the 9x5 Impressions catalogue carried a quote by Gérôme: "When you draw, form is the important thing, but in painting, the first thing to look for is the general impression of colour." Now that had appeared in a letter from the American artist Kenyon Fox in the Century magazine in February 1889. Now this is the cultural milieu in which Jane Sutherland and Clara Southern were working, while Roberts himself described the approach. He said in 1893 how artists, in seeking out subjects, had looked into the quiet face of nature, lingering where the winding, almost silent river bathes the feathery wattle branches, sometimes on a hillside, watching the sun setting over a range and a valley, while the far-off hills go distant and more distant in the grey dusk until the moon rises in the quiet east, finding beauty in odd corners of some country shanty or by some lagoon, which palely reflects the banks all bathed in a great shimmer of trembling, brilliant sunshine. Now that idea of finding beauty in odd corners also implies dwelling there, observing, immersing oneself on sight, what James Elkins has described as an unalienated insider's apprehension of the land. So rather than seeing the land only in terms of who possesses it, who owns it, it is what Jason Womberg has described as coming into a natural place, free from the constraints of power. That is, an ideology, escaping ideology. This paper considers how both male and female artists did just that. Jane Sutherland's male colleagues frequently portrayed an intimate landscape from the inside out. For instance, when Streeton and Roberts moved to Sydney in 1890, they camped at Sirius Cove, as only male artists could. That is, they inhabited the landscape. This painting that's in Continental Shift, Streeton's painting of Sydney in the distance viewed across the water and from a bush perspective, presents a melding of the bush ethos with a glimmer of metropolitan life. But the relationship between the bush and the city is one-sided. The scene is more an atmospheric haze of smoke from the chimney stacks, the other in the distance, with the complexities of the modern city glossed over. The high-keyed blue tones of the water compared to the bleached browns of the rocks bordering the cove, what's been called a glare aesthetic, operating via strong tonal contrasts, suggests the optimistic bright sunlight of a new nation. Streeton's approach in this landscape is subjective, doubtless clouded from his time immersed in it, camping, what James Elkins has described as an exemplary encounter with subjectivity, articulating the sense of self. But this perspective of Sirius Cove from the viewpoint of inhabiting the bush is also deeply gendered, as women artists couldn't have camped there and presented it in that way. Impressionist artists also turned to a range of metropolitan subjects, such as Conder's impression of Balmoral Beach, a favourite site of recreation, conveying that sense of the fleeting image. He shows the bright blue-white light of the sea, women walking on that hazy pink sand. Each figure, or wispy grass or tree, is barely a gestural stroke. And it was work like Streeton's and Conder's in which the primary impulse was impressionism rather than nationalism, which prompted Daniel Thomas, when discussing the exhibition New Worlds from Old, to observe that the Australian Impressionist work looked more international in its gesturing towards aestheticism, Japanism and naturalism, and that despite past claims, they seemed to be painting with un-Australian, art-conditioned eyes. Yet, irrespective of the artists' agendas about the direction of art, the centenary of settlement was approaching and thoughts turned to defining national identity amid ongoing debates about the Australian states becoming a federated nation within the British Commonwealth rather than self-governed colonies. Literary magazines such as The Bulletin were host to a school of writers such as Banjo Patterson, who were situating national identity nostalgically in bush types. And we have a perfect example in Continental Shift, the McCubbin painting, even though most Australians lived in cities. In art, there was a climate of intense speculation as to what it was to be Australian, and calls for a landscape art capable of expressing what were perceived to be the unique qualities of the brilliant Australian sunlight. And with this growing nationalism, the plein air landscape style, which had been dismissed by critics up to then as foreign, was now seen as belonging in the mainstream art practice. Central to these debates then were the issues of landscape, and as Virginia Spate has observed, the role of Australia's unique landscape is in the formation of a new society. The landscape was conceived as flooded with light, transparent. It was a land of fruitfulness, of health, a landscape whose great spaces encouraged freedom and initiative, a landscape lending itself to a society that would inherit the benefits but not the evils of European culture, which was seen increasingly, whatever its lures, as decadent, hypocritical, unhealthy and opaque. This then is the crux of the double nature of Australian Impressionism, and while its artists sought to be true to the perception of the momentary effect of light, in the years leading up to Federation in 1901, there was a new function for golden light, which symbolised the desires clustering around the notion of Australia as a new land, a land of abundance, health and happiness. But in relation to heroic figures of the past inhabiting the landscape, public memory in the years around the centenary of settlement was selective. So bush pioneers of the kind that I've mentioned, McCubbins, those kinds of bush pioneers were celebrated, but not the convict figures of the deeper past. Landscape paintings, therefore, are clearly carriers of national meaning. And as W.J.T. Mitchell has written, landscape is a particular historical formation at the very heart of Impressionism. But much of their work isn't landscape work. American artists, of course, were exposed to Monet's work when it was exhibited in New York in 1886. So just to conclude, Impressionist landscapes are complex. They appear to subvert power relations because they frequently portray an intimate... I'm out of time, aren't I? Just last paragraph. They frequently portray an intimate relationship between the landscape and its new inhabitants through casual, everyday subject matter, often of intensely familiar local landscapes, while its technique reveals the means by which it creates the illusion and invites the spectator to participate in the process. Australian Impressionist paintings by women are painted as much from the inside out as those by the male artists, but their work confounds a simple equation of a modern nation with masculinism, while their subjects are less strident. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathy, for that very warm, I won't say feminine, but I will say feminist invitation into the landscape. We have time for a couple of questions, then we're going to take a short break before we come back for the final round table. So does anybody have any questions for Cathy? Up the back.
Thank you very much. That was most interesting. May I please be very cheeky and offer a feminist, more feminist interpretation of, I'm not sure if it's Jane Sutherland's obstruction or obstacle. Obstruction, is it?
Yep.
Yes, and suggest that a plucky young lady like that would not be put off by a twig or a bridge or a fence, but it was
Or a bull.
But it was the bull, I think,
bull, yeah.
which is full of symbolism. Thank you.
Thank you, Cathy. That was a wonderful supply of perspective that we've had. And in that paper, you described various ways of being in the landscape as a contrast to more grasping and long-reaching representations. And I was fascinated to see the William Barrack, and you'll know a wonderful little catalogue of a few years ago, which was very much about the difference between the way in which corroborees were represented by Western artists and how William Barrack did it. And that includes the fact that he knew what was going on in those ceremonies, and he treated them as narratives as they were, and invites the viewer to participate in them in various ways. But I just wondered if you could characterise the different ways in which you can see the landscape from inside out. You're obviously making a distinction between women and between female and male representatives of landscape. How would you say that differs from William Barrack?
Well, that's a hard one.
I know that is too.
Can I just do the first
one? All right.
Yeah. What got me going with the paper, is that there are conventional accounts of male and female artists painting the landscape, and I thought that's just not good enough. I think recent landscape theory actually gives us the tools to think about how the women, from a point of view of disadvantage, because they weren't able to immerse themselves in the landscape like Streeton and Roberts and Camp at Sirius Cove, but in fact that they were using other ways in which to immerse themselves in the landscape. So that's really what I was doing, using current landscape theory, but also visual analysis to actually insert yourself in the landscape, because I think we've actually been superficial in our looking.
Can I do a follow-up question?
Yes,
and that's in relation to the manifestations of naturalism outside of Australia. So, it's a massive international movement, and is there, you've given a few American examples, but do you know whether there is in the broader European or British, more specifically, setting, the Glasgow boys, there were Glasgow girls, weren't there? Were they Glasgow girls? Yeah.
I had done my homework on the Glasgow girls, but that's why I appealed to my American colleagues to help me with the American work, because Australian Impressionism was a short-lived movement before many of those artists went overseas and became expatriates. But it was more inclusive than I can find. But I'd actually like to hear what the Americans have to say about that.
So what you're saying is that the Impressionist movement in Australia was more inclusive and accepting of women artists?
Just that they couldn't stay overnight, but they found other ways around it. There's one difference.
Yeah, I think you're probably right to a certain extent, because the women that we tend to think of as American Impressionists were only American Impressionists when they got to France, and they weren't really able to become part of the gang stateside. So I think that's probably right, although there's the complicating factor of expatriatism. So it's a very different kind of not a very different, but a somewhat different kind of belonging and not.
And they were painting portraits, figures in the landscape, or it was after 1900.
Yes, that's right. Can I ask a question since I have the mic?
Who would stop?
Okay. So this question is somewhat related to Richard's, because I found what you had to say about different ways of being in the landscape extraordinarily interesting. And so for the women about whom you were speaking, there was a kind of a visualization, or I don't want to say fiction, but maybe fantasy of immersion, right? And so they're using paint and composition and the very act of painting to bring about a kind of immersion. And for the men, what you have is a kind of automatic possession. I am there, I possess. And then you showed a picture of children in the landscape, which is yet another version of being in the landscape. It's not a kind of empathy, immersion, or possession way of being in the landscape, but an intuitive, organic. I mean, you seem to evoke the notion of an innocent eye, or a being not even habituated to the landscape, but just being in it naturally. And so where does that fit? I mean, as a kind of fantasy or ideal of being in the landscape, the child's point of view, and is it gendered?
May I interrupt very briefly? And that is to point out there's a wonderful painting by Julian Ashton called A Chip of the Old Block, and it's got an old bearded bushman watching a little boy attempting to chop a log on for firewood. So there you have the masculinist conquest, very, very clearly articulated, and that's mid-1880s.
Not just that, you've got McCubbin, in fact, painting children lost in the landscape. So you've got Sutherland showing children safe.
No.
Where are we going?
Okay, last question up the side, and then we. Oh, sorry, two more. I beg your pardon.
I'll just grabbing this. Thank you. But what's interesting about Box Hill and Sirius Cove, etc., is of course they're on the fringes of the metropolitan centre.
Yeah,
exactly. These are not men immersing themselves in the landscape. They're not travelling off for days and days and days and going to Central Australia. They're getting on a train, they're travelling 2 hours, they're going on a horse or a cart or something for another couple of hours, and then they get to go home on Monday.
it was a fiction. They would immerse themselves in the landscape, but then they would go back to the studio.
They were painting for an intensely urban audience.
That's right.
Melbourne is the second largest city in the British Empire. You know, these were paintings that were being done for a highly urbanized audience of sites that were on the edge of their own city. A sort of view of the bush that was already mythologized. And that's fascinating how rapidly that happened.
But also within Impressionism there is that city-bush nexus all the time.
And one last one before we go wherever else we were coming back.
I was just going to make a comment which kind of ties in with what you were just saying too, and also you touched on it very briefly. You talked about Tom Roberts' depictions of Indigenous people. I think that's really important because he actually did go further afield. He went to far north Queensland.
He did.
And he pictured Indigenous people gathering for very ceremonial purposes, as well as portraits of Indigenous people. And I think what's interesting is, was it the fact that he was not Australian born and didn't feel the need in the same way to lay claim to the landscape that allowed him to do that.
No, very important.
I think that's a statement rather than a question, and I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I think that federation impulse. There was a radical member of Parliament whose name escapes me at the time of the centenary of the landing of the First Fleet, who asked a question in Parliament, and because the celebration seemed to focus on lots of banquets for politicians and wealthy merchants, and this radical politician asked the Premier of New South Wales, Henry Parkes, if there was going to be an opportunity for the common people, for the destitute, for the Salvation Army clients to actually have some share of this goodness. And he said yes, and the honourable member may rest assured that it will be done. And then the follow-up question was, and the Aborigines? And Parkes replied, what? And remind them that we have robbed them.
Wow.
And that's 1888, or thereabouts, yeah. So there's the prevailing mindset. And on that miserable note, I'll invite you all to take a break and come back refreshed and cheerful for a final session of plenary